Today's lecture is on some advanced UI techniques. So we're going to start off today with a few code examples, and then from there we're going to work into an actual slideshow in Microsoft PowerPoint, just talking about a lot of the things that I've learned over the years on how to present the user interface and give the user a better experience. So before we do that, let's take a look at this first example that I have here that's posted on Canvas. And so let's just take a look and run this. And what this is going to do is this is just going to show us different ways of laying out our user interface for the end user. So it's extremely important, to think about, what your end target is, who your end user is. Is this going to be displayed on the internet? Is it going to be displayed on the internet? Is it a Windows application? Is it going to have to be displayed on the desktop browser? It's going to have to be displayed also on a mobile browser. There's just lots of different things to consider. Do you have, the ability to know what the resolution will be on the end monitors this is ran on? Like if it's just something within your company, do you know what the resolution is going to be? Is it the same for all monitors? Does it need to be dynamic, for a whole bunch of different resolutions? So you really have to think about how you can grow and shrink your form, because some people like a lot higher resolution, some people have a really low resolution. So this article here is going to give us some ideas of how we can lay out some of these different techniques. So here's kind of a very simple layout here, and really this is sort of like the worst way you can do it. This is a hard coding type of example. Everything is hard coded where it's at, but it looks okay, but it's just hard coded. There's no flexibility, there's nothing dynamic to it. This one's slightly better, and we'll see why it's slightly better when we take a look at it behind the scenes. Next example is a stacked example. Now you can see it kind of is fluid a little bit more, and now we got things stacked on top of each other. And this one is going to show us how we don't hard code the positions, and each one's relative to each other. And here we're using stack panels, so we got a little bit more flexibility built into our UI here. Then here's where we're actually creating a view, right? So the same sort of data is being presented, but you can see how much more professional it is. Obviously they've done tab controls up here. They've created icons for buttons. You can see this, they have this nice gradient background, and how everything's actually laid out, and all the styles are actually pulled out into a separate file. So let's take a look now. So for each of these buttons, they just open up a different style, is all this does. So let's take a look now at this first one, this naive example. And you can see the problem with it is that as we start looking through all of these, all we have is text blocks here. And we can see that they're just sort of hard-coded. All we're doing is these margins in order to give them, separation between each two. And each one has a position that's hard-coded. You can see that we're inside of a grid, but we're not even using rows and columns. Again, everything is just sort of hard-coded and bound right in here. So let's take a look at another one that's slightly better. And so in this one, now we've actually got some column definitions. We haven't hard-coded, per se the positions. Now we've said, okay, now we're actually going to use a grid layout to start laying these things out. So by doing this, we're starting to make the positions a little bit more relative and a little bit more flexible by doing it this way and then adding in styles later on. Next example is the stacked approach. And so in here we're just using a stack panel. Now again, what's nice about this is it can start giving you the flexibility of different resolutions, of growing and shrinking, where you're not hard coding things, they're just relative to each other here by using this stack panel. And you can start using the star spacing, and there's various things you can do with this in the previous example, where it just makes things a little bit more flexible on your user interface. And so generally it's a good idea to have things either in a grid or a stack panel so that you can then support multiple resolutions versus just using a canvas and hard coding them. That may be the easiest and fastest way to do them, but in the long run it ends up usually costing you more money and actually being harder to fix bugs. So the last example was that view that they were using, and so you can see this is actually how it's set up originally in here. And you've got these text boxes, but you'll notice there's almost no user interface type code in here. And so it's just text block, and then that's it. And then there's a style, this data edit layout style applied to it. And so if we take a look at it, which I think is this one, and so inside here, I believe here's the data edit layout style. You can see within here, we're starting to set the panels. We've got a template that we've set up that we're binding to. So you can see everything that and this is a little bit more complex than we need to get in to explain, everything that's in here. But it's just the idea that you want to always try to put as little in your user interface as possible and pull it out into these other, resource dictionaries or some other file, your app.xaml file, something. That's where you want to define, all of this. Just the equivalent of, you don't want your code behind your UI, you want to pull it out in your business logic. It's the same when you're hard coding all that behind your UI. It just makes it less flexible. Where if you can do things like this, then you just apply that a template or the style to all of your windows, and they're all going to look the same, and then you can update them all in the same spot. So let's take a look at another example here. And what I think is really neat about this example is this control right here is just a list box. That's all this control is working with, okay? And it's called restaurant list. Now when we have this combo box and we select different items from the combo box, it calls this switch style. And so all it does is it says this combo box, or sorry, not combo box, but a list box, it says just change its style. And so all this does is just returns a style here. And so this is how you can set a style in C# code. And so you can see get style was just a method that they wrote. It comes down here and we can see application.current. We pass in the name of the style. That gives us the resource. Then we return it as a style. And so all it's doing is in the combo box, you select it, and then it returns these various styles that are defined for a list box. So it's kind of interesting to see just how powerful a list box is by changing the styles and templates for it. So here's your very typical list box, right? So you just bind a collection to it, and you don't really apply any sort of style to it, just very plain. But now let's do something like a simple style. Now look how much just better this looks just by adding a simple image next to the name, right? Just going from the default to this, it just really does help add something on what you want to select. It just, it's so much easier to find the burger and, the avocado. Now let's go to columns. Now look at this. This almost looks like a data grid. Now remember, this is just a list box. It's exactly the same. The exact same data is bound to it that we're seeing in these other examples. It's just the style and template has changed, and so we're just binding different pieces of data to each of these columns, and we're just deciding what we want to put in them. Here's a modern look. So look how professional this one looks as we scroll down, or don't. I can scroll bar here. So as I scroll through these, you can see just how much more professional this actually looks. Let me make this a little larger for us. So we can see now we've got a picture over here. We can clearly see the title of each of these places, and then we can see here's some of the sub details. Here's the main piece of detail, and here's the ratings. We're rating restaurants or whatever else in here. But we can see each one that's selected. We can see very easily, the type of food that we're dealing with. Let's take a look at another one. So here's a grid format. So again, almost looks like a data grid, but this is actually a list box. The list box is very, very flexible. Here's what's called floating. Now this one's kind of cool because it actually has some animation that actually runs. And again, it's kind of flamboyant almost. It's not really necessary, but it just shows you the power of what you can do with styles. And here's a map. Yeah, that does make, so that's kind of cool. Again, this is a list box. So again, you have to remember that. Here's a rating system. Kind of looks like a chart control. Here's a scatter. Here's a 3D, which is kind of neat that you can kind of scroll through. I mean, it looks like garbage, but it's kind of fun to scroll through the different items. So let's see how they did that. So really, you can see that this user interface has virtually no code behind it. Why? Because they did it properly. And all they did was pulled all of that data, all that complex logic into these styles. So if we take a look at the different styles, we can open this up, and we can see just some of the different styles here that we can go. So for instance, list simple, we can come over here and take a look, and we can see, okay, here's our style and our target. We've got some resources with a solid color brush, and then they've set the item template, and you can see all they've done is a stack panel with a rectangle and a label. And so it was a very, very simple style, and that's all they've really done here. So let's take a look at list columns. So we come over here to list columns. Okay, now they've added in a little bit more toward their stack panel. Now they've had rectangles and labels and another grid here. And so if we were to run this one for the columns now, so let's take a look at the columns. So you can see what they've done is, again, remember, when you're doing a data template, your imagination is the limit. And you can see they've said, I'm going to now define what it is for this list box. What's nice about a list box, it's made for you to bind a collection to it. And then how you display that data is completely up to you. You just think of a row, and how do you want to display that row? And a stack panel makes sense. You can see each rectangle here, and that's what they've got. And they've even got this little rectangle in between here to differentiate between the different columns. And all they've done is they've just bound to the property names that are in that collection. So let's take a look maybe at modern now. So we jump back into here and we open up the modern one. And again, it's going to be a little bit more, in depth in order to write this, but you can kind of start deciphering it. We can see, okay, we've come in here, we've got a data template, we've got this grid, let's see, style, so they've just got some bunch of column definitions here of rows and columns. Then they've started setting it up. They've got this rectangle here, so here's the logo, that picture. Then next to that, you can see that they've got a stack panel, and they've moved it over a little bit from the picture. Then they've got labels binding to the name. They've got another stack panel. So they just came up with how they wanted it to look for this modern. They kind of maybe sketched it out on a piece of paper. And then so if someone gave you this visually, you could probably see, okay, I'm going to have a column, right? Here's one column, here's two columns. Okay, now on top of that, look, here's one line, two line, three line, four lines. This is pretty easy to do, sure enough, in a stack panel. So all you do is have a grid, and then a stack panel in the second column. And then you have the stack panel that just lists out 4 different items. And then from there, okay, I just need to do, an item here, and then this is going to be a bound item. And sure enough, you can see here's address, here's street, zip, so they're all there. And then down below is the next stack panel. And then, they've got these stars over here, which they've, if we come down here, here's the average rating. So, and that's part of this. So, and there's lots of different ways you could have created, this look of it. And so, we can come down here to the float or the 3D and take a look at, how they actually, again, it's going to be a little bit more, we're starting to getting geometry and math, and these transitions on how it's looking, and it starts to, you have to add in some more code. Like for instance, on the float one, you're going to have to start handling some events behind the scenes. So you're going to have to start, they actually do these floating grids, so you can notice there's actually some math involved because we're transitioning, we're adding storyboards. So it's kind of neat that you can add in these things on the fly. And again, it's just some basic math and just transitions. And it looks really complex, but I'm sure if you, really started, if we spent some time, we could walk through here, and figure out, here's the last going to, here's the transition. So we know the current x coordinate, we know where it needs to go, and then we can animate it there from point A to point B, and that's kind of what this logic is doing. So again, you could spend all of your time just writing the plumbing for connecting to the database and filling up a collection, and someone who understands the user interface could write these data templates in order to make the data display really nice like this. Then when you merge your projects together, you get this really nice end product that looks really professional. So hopefully this kind of helps just give you some ideas of what you really can create with WPF and why it is really superior to Windows Forms. Alright, so now what I want to do is we're going to kind of go through a presentation now, and this is going to be a little bit different than the way we've done it before. Let's go ahead and swap that. And so what we're going to do is, let's go back to slide 1, is we're just going to walk through this presentation. What I've done here is over the years, I've gone to a tremendous amount of seminars put on by Microsoft or other various companies, and every time I go to these seminars, I almost always try to go to the little sessions that have something to do with user interface design. Now, why do I do that? Because I know that that's where my skills are lacking the most. I'm pretty good at writing those deep, dark dungeon, super hard, math equations and, getting things done down there, but making things look pretty, I just have trouble with it. So I constantly challenge myself to read books and look at different interface designs and how other people do it, and then go to these sessions. And so this presentation is really sort of, a lot of the things I've learned over the years put into a single presentation. So we're going to be talking about what makes an effective UI and how different ideas that you can do for that. So if you can, a user can just run your application and intuitively know what they should be clicking on and just proceed from page to page, that's an effective user interface. So think how many times maybe you've given whether it's a parent or sibling or whoever it was, a grandparent. Think of them getting a brand new phone, or they're getting their computer and they come to ask you for help. Whatever it is, this user interface that they have to deal with, they didn't know what button to click next. They didn't know how to send this email, or whatever that interface was. I'm sure you have all kinds of examples where you've had to help family members because they knew you were in computer science on how to help them do something with technology. Well, there are certain things they probably needed lots of help with, and some things that they could just sort of figure out themselves if they tried a little bit. Well, that's the difference between a bad UI and a good UI. Is yes, the more complex an application, the more things it needs to do, there may just need to be some training on it. That's just a reality. However, if this is sort of a public application, like maybe a phone app or something to that nature, then you really need to make it intuitive. Which button does what. You need to understand how what swipes on the phone do, and expand and contract with finger motions. And so you really need to focus on that so the user doesn't get frustrated with your application. The next is giving the user a good and first impression of the software. I can't tell you, we do this, you do this too. I mean, think about how fast you judge an application just by the way it looks or the way it interacts. It could have the most complex, well-structured, well-maintained code behind the scenes, but you don't care, right? None of us do. We just want it to work and do what we want. We don't want to get lost and frustrated using that. And so if they start running your app in the first 5 minutes, they just hate it, no matter how amazing your application really is, no matter how powerful it is. If just it simply looks outdated and it's hard to use, again, the user is just going to have a bad first impression, and they're not going to buy your software or buy your product. Now, a big part of a lot of the applications you're probably going to write is to help someone do their job. So if you're having a government contract, I work for Boeing, we have government contracts and we're going to help someone do a job. Generally, maybe we need to do some analysis so we can predict failures on something. So they need to write these, run these complex reports. So what we need to do is someone else's job is to figure out, predict failures in a particular system, whatever it is. And so you need to make their job easier. So you need to make reports so they can figure out, and be able to present the government with the correct data as fast as possible. So again, you have to take your end user in mind. Let's go like to our final group project. Your end users, maybe a little mom and pop shop, they're selling jewelry, and their job, they simply just want to be able to get that customer rung up as fast as possible, in their machine there. They don't want to have to be confused on how to take their credit card information, how to search for invoices, how to add it up and do all these things. Your job is to make their life easier in their business. That's what they're paying you to do. And so how can you do that? Well, one way is how you organize your user interface. So just like those example programs we just looked at, the flow and the layout can make a big difference on the usability and then the impression the users were going to get. So just imagine going back to those list box examples. If you just use a very typical list box that just has text displayed in it versus someone else who's selling a comparable product to yours now, and they've got pictures and graphics and gradients. I mean, just automatically, no matter how much better code you write, no matter how much more yours does, theirs just looks better. And again, a lot of people judge things just by, let's just say don't judge a book by its cover, but that's really the reality when it comes to software. A lot of people do that. So that's the user interface and your navigation, but you also need to make sure your app is consistent, which a lot of projects fail at because they don't take the time up front to architect the overall consistency of their application. So what I mean by that is if you have 5-10 different developers on your project and each one goes off to create a report or some sort of user interface and you didn't architect it beforehand, every one of those user interfaces is going to be different, some slightly different, some completely different. And so when a user runs as one application versus another application, there's not going to be any consistency between the two about where buttons are laid out, about how you select dates, about how you create the report, and delete information or insert information. And so you really want your applications to be consistent throughout. User communication. So how are you going to communicate errors? How are you going to communicate invalid data? How are you going to communicate what the user needs to enter to do their job? So again, you want that consistent throughout your entire application. I can't tell you how often or not, it's hard. It's a lot harder than you'd think to keep your end users in mind. And the biggest reason we fail at this is because we're so just ingrained in our application. We know exactly how it should work. We know exactly what button you should click, exactly how you should get the job done, and how this application works, that it's hard for us to disconnect ourselves in order to put ourselves in the end user's shoes. And so this is where you really need to turn your application over to someone who has never seen it before and say, hey, is it obvious what you should do first? If you click this button and I give you this message, is it obvious how you fix this invalid data? Things of that nature. So make sure your instructions are clear. Make sure your labels, give them, maybe have little tool tips, whatever you can do to make their life easier. Another thing is make your application forgiving. So your application, the end users are going to fat finger data in. They're going to not select the right things. You really want to make it as forgiving as possible, and yet help them along the way as much as possible, so they can get things done as fast as possible. So this other one is by highlighting important areas. Again, you don't want your user to feel lost and not know what to do next. And so there's various things you can do: subtle animations. You can make things enabled, disabled. You can change things to bold or unbold, or change the font color or colors. There's lots of different ways that you can sort of help the user navigate through your application and draw the user's attention to certain areas. Now this last one is extremely important. How will the UI be used? Will it always be on a tablet? Let's say what you're doing is a person is on an assembly line, and so they need a tablet. This is a technician that they can walk around with this tablet that's connected to the Wi-Fi, so they can get status on various machines, right? So this application was built for someone to walk around on a shop floor. Fine, that's your user interface. You have to know that going into it. However, is this same application not only going to be used on a tablet but also on a PC? Well, maybe sometimes someone needs to connect remotely. Maybe there's a super user and they got the day off and they don't have to come in, so they can log in via their phone. So there's lots of different things you need to keep in mind, that maybe you need to figure out which platform you're on and apply the appropriate styles to that. Is this application going to be used outdoors? So then you need to understand the screen brightness and different colors that are going to appear outdoors versus indoors. And again, always the dealing with various resolutions is just an absolute nightmare. So tools of the trade, we've talked about Expression Blend. Expression Design is sort of like an Adobe Acrobat kind of, Adobe Illustrator, where you can actually start drawing graphics and actually creating graphics for your application. There's Photoshop and other tools out there. I just highly recommend that when you're doing WPF or Silverlight, if you ever do happen to have to do Silverlight, and there's a lecture on Silverlight, that you just focus using Expression Blend versus Visual Studio, and you really do abstract out your styles and templates. Again, Expression Design is just a really nice tool, especially for creating vector graphics, which the nice thing about vector graphics, if you don't need an actual picture and it's graphics you can sort of draw and color in, kind of cartoonish, then it's nice because vector graphics are math based, and so everything's with a point, and it's what's really, really fast, where it can grow and shrink dynamically to fill the screen. And so that's the difference between a vector graphic and bitmap images. So when you're using these things like JPEGs and TIFF and BMPs, then they're sort of hard coded, where a vector graphic can grow and shrink, and they're going to be very fast to load because there's less information associated with them. And again, they're going to look better at different resolutions. But sometimes it's a person. You're going to have to use a JPEG because it's just a picture of a person or a house, something of that nature. But if you have ways you can use vector graphics, I would try to use those if possible. Again, just various formats, just need to be aware of them and understand the pluses and minuses of the different types of formats. So working with color, this is kind of an art. And again, it's hard because it's not just a black and white sort of thing. Some people are going to like the way your application looks, and other people are going to hate it, and some people just think it's okay. So again, it's kind of beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So, but you just there's some techniques that you still can use to the best of your ability. And again, there's just no perfect answer, but there's some good resources and tips you can do. And so when you're using color, you need to use it wisely and do it to draw people's attention, but you don't want to make it just way too intense for the user to where it almost gives them eye strain. Again, it's going to take away from your application if you do that. So there's actually a psychology of colors. Now, again, you kind of take this with a grain of salt, but you just kind of look through that, it really is true. Red, it's an alert, it's dramatic. Again, what does it mean? It always means a stop sign, stop. Blue, thoughtful, calming. We think a lot of companies, even Boeing has their, corporate logo with blue, IBM, Dell. I mean, as soon as you see these names, you can almost sort of picture those colors associated with them, that bluish color that they do. There's even other companies that have like green as their company logo. So a neutral color, it's more restful to the human eye. Orange, it's playful. Again, there's other the non-corporate market branding like MCI and Vonage, things like that. Black, again, black backgrounds can diminish readability, but again, it can almost bring out certain graphics more. And if you use black appropriately, it can almost make it look a little bit more high-tech-ish. Again, you have to use it appropriate though. Yellow, you need to be really careful with, just because it can definitely add some fatigue to the eye, and it can be very hard to read a lot of times. So you just need to be really careful with the color yellow. Again, pink, okay, it's just sort of, reduce angry behavior. Sure, take that for what it's worth, but again, it's just kind of another off color. You just need to keep it in mind. So now this one I think is really useful, and it's just different color schemes, and I really like to use this. And what it is that, okay, you pick a nice color that you want, like a bluish color in this instance. Then what you do in this monochromatic scheme, so this is a scheme for how you want your entire application to work. And a monochromatic scheme means is that all you're going to do is give basically different, you're going to change the chroma and value within a single hue. So this single color blue, you can see the different colors of blue that we're going to use. So it's your whole entire application is just going to use various shades here. And so that's one way. It's called a monochromatic scheme. Okay, fine. Another idea is an analogous scheme. And so it's you on the primary wheel, you can see that this color and this color here, they sometimes they're analogous to each other, and there's not as much contrast as other schemes. And so it's kind of nice that, okay, if I pick this color, well then this is probably also another good color to use within my there's a complementary scheme, so opposite colors on the primary wheel, so additive colors, split complementary, so again it's just different ways that this color and this color. Again, offset warm colors against cool colors. Intrinsically, it's high contrast when you need something of that nature. Just another scheme. Now, this is a really neat program. So let's go ahead and go out to this website here. And what's nice about this is, okay, we just talked about these, right? Here's monochromatic. Now watch, as I just drag this around, okay, let's go to that corporate logos of blue. And so what's really neat here is I can start picking these different colors, and you can see it actually gives me the value of how I can build these colors. So you can see this is the red, the green, and the blue value, or here's the hex value that I can just paste into my code when I'm defining certain colors. Again, here's complementary. So what's nice is as you move these around, you can see it's giving me the various colors that I can use within my application. So it's a nice way that if you have trouble like I do with understanding if I'm going to use this color, maybe I can figure out I want this first shade of blue here. This is really pretty. What would be some other good colors to use in my application to give me an idea or just sort of inspire me? Maybe just follow with some of these schemes like this. Here's different, just very simple different shades of blue that you can use throughout your application, and maybe some nice white colors for text or something to draw the user's eye to other things like that. So this is a really great tool just to give you some ideas of different color schemes within your application. So gradients, these are wonderful to make your application sort of look sharp, and just more natural to the human eye, because again, in the real world, we're surrounded by gradients. That's how we view the world. Based on where our lighting is, that's how your gradients are going to appear on the walls around us. So look around you right now. Turn the light on, turn the light off, and watch the walls. How there might probably is like a slight gradient where it's light at the top and goes a little bit darker towards the bottom. Even if you don't, it's hard to notice. If you pay attention, you can see it. But why didn't you notice? Because it's natural. That's the world we live in. So that's why gradients, just like this particular screen has, this slide has, you can see how it's light and then darker up here. It's a little bit more subtle, and it's nicer to the eye. It's more natural. And so if you just make subtle gradients within your app, it just makes such a better presentation for the end user, where instantly, if you see an app that was done 15, 20 years ago, and you notice that hard black and white lines, like here's one color, then here's another color, and there's just a sharp line in between them, you can just tell, you can pick up that this was Windows 95, or something to that nature. It's just blatantly obvious. Fonts, again, you need to understand, there is an art to making characters readable. Do this experiment next time you're driving down, a road in your neighborhood, in some main part of your city. Start looking at business signs. Look at company logos. Pay attention to how the big companies display data. How do they present, what they're selling? What's the name of their store versus some of the smaller stores? And what you'll notice is that those large companies, they were, they spent a lot of money with designers on how to make, just as you're driving down the road, the fonts readable as you're driving by, because you've got a second or two, just that's all you can pay attention. Where these small companies, a lot of times when you drive by it, it's hard to even pick up the text on some of these signs, because again, they didn't understand user interface and graphic design. They just put up a sign, said, hey, just use black bold letters. Where these other companies understood what it takes, what they're trying to solve. The problem they're trying to solve is the person's in a car driving fast down a road. They need to be able to see my sign quickly. Or if you're looking at a menu, think about how professional. I mean, as weird as it sounds, go to McDonald's or any other chain restaurant and look at how they present their menu to you, where it draws your eyes, what type of fonts they're using, the colors of their fonts. These are the kind of things that can inspire you in your own application. So the next time you go out to eat or you go get gas or whatever it is, take a look now at how people are presenting these interfaces to you, and again with font sizes and colors, and you can pick up real fast what you like and what you don't like. What things could you read clearly, what things were hard to get the information out that you wanted, and then you can apply those into your application. So I just want to kind of mention shaders. And shaders are just little programs that actually run on your GPU. And so what's nice about these is that if you need to, show a constant, like a ripple effect animation, like in a pool of water, or there's something you need to add on your application, there are these things called shader programs, and they run on the GPU, and they're very, very fast. And so again, if you're interested in this stuff, then you can sort of look up more on this high-level shader language, and you can look up shaders, and there's lots of examples on the internet. I just kind of wanted you to be aware of them if you ever do need to work with them. So animations, we've learned about storyboards and what it takes to create the animations in Blend. Now the thing about animations is they're really fun to play with, but they can almost be annoying to end users. So always make sure your animations are subtle and that they're creating value to the end user. So right now, pick up your phone and open an application, or swipe left or right in this application. Now notice what happened there. When you clicked on an application and it started up, the whole screen didn't just instantly appear with your application. Notice it again, do it again, close it down, open it up again, even on Windows or whatever else. Did you notice that there's actually an animation that almost like grows and expands into your window? It happens extremely fast, but it doesn't just instantly appear. And they chose to make it that way. When you swipe left on your phone, there's a reason. There's actually an animation. See how it kind of blends left and right? And the phones are kind of the best design of where you see this a lot versus a Windows type environment. But those animations, now do this, you'll notice, like in the future, when you're trying to get a job done, maybe on an application on your phone or your computer, and it picks up that there's like half a second delay because it wants to show you a cute animation over and over again, and you just want to, and you're repeating the same thing over and over again. You have to keep waiting for the phone to catch up or the computer to catch up. Again, that's taking away from the user's experience because you wanted to put some little animation in there. So you need to be very quick with these. And so with the animations, you want to have them less than, probably half a second or 0.3 seconds. Again, very, very quick. Make them subtle and classy over flashy and fancy. I promise you, this is the fun stuff. So when you're first playing with animations and you're doing them in these class, make them as flashy and fancy as you want. In the real world, though, be very careful with your animations. So again, just the animations and the transitions work hand in hand with how you transition from page to page, and things like that. So just be careful with that. Here's a really good resource for clip art, especially with vector graphics. It's called Zamalot. And it's just one resource I found that's really handy out there to get some art and just different things that you can make your icons really stand out, for instance. So we've talked about this multiple times, but it's so important I want to talk about it again. And this is just the idea that you want to pull out these different resources and put them, again, you've got your colors, you want to pull them out into a resource file or resource dictionary. And so that you're always binding to these resources versus just putting in, hard coding the background color for various things. So you really want to just focus on as little hard coding as you can with your UI elements. And again, it's helpful to put them in a resource dictionary, and you just think of them as libraries, just like you have code libraries that you can, fall back on. So static versus dynamic, these resources, static are going to be, they're lighter, they're fast, they're applied right away, and they're static, which means they're not going to change at runtime. Or if you're going to need them, to change on the fly and be reapplied as they change, then you're going to need to use dynamic resources. So always remember that everything you're doing in your styles are just .NET objects, and you can manipulate them, and you can get this resource collection, and you can manipulate them programmatically. So just be careful with that, because again, if you are manipulating programmatically, you can need dynamic versus static resources. So you always want to put them in resource dictionaries. Again, this is a really good tip here. Just avoid putting them directly into your app.xaml file, because it just fills up. And we've already looked at some of these resource dictionaries, and they're just gigantic. And so it's nice if you can, again, just like you would consolidate things into various classes, you would consolidate your, what styles make sense and resources make sense, and put them all into a single resource dictionary versus putting everything in your app.xaml file. Again, just breaking things out, understanding, put different resources that deal with colors or fonts or control styles or templates, and breaking them up into the appropriate resource dictionaries. So with styles, okay, so we're talking about resources, so the style is the main resource. Just like a cascading style sheet in HTML, you want to pull that out, put all those fonts and the font sizes and colors, and put those into the resource dictionaries, and don't hard code them into individual controls. Controls are lookless in WPF, and so you have, by default, they're applied a style that Microsoft said this is what a button will look like, this is what a list box will look like. But never forget, that's the power of WPF, is you can make that list box look however you want, just like that example we just barely looked at. We made a list box looks like a grid or a map, or just as plain as can be. So you can do anything you want to it. You just have the data bound, and it's up to you how you want it displayed. Okay, we've covered that enough times. We've talked about templates. So templates versus styles, where a template is contained within a style. Sometimes people get a little bit confused on that. Skinning, so this is just the idea that your whole entire skinning is just a theme for your entire application. It's the skin of the application. So this is where a lot of programs will fail, because again, they'll have multiple developers creating different UIs, and it's not consistent throughout. So just make sure you organize things. Just like your code will get unmanageable really fast, all of these resources and styles get unmanageable really fast unless from the beginning you organize them appropriately. So hopefully, these different tips and tricks kind of give you some different ideas on how to create a better looking and more professional user interface.